I am presenting Union Gospel Press's Sunday School Lesson number 1, Start of the Winter Quarter, Sunday, December 7th, 2025. The lesson is entitled, The Glory of the Lord. Lesson text comes from Exodus chapter 33, verses 12 through 23. Related scriptures are Exodus 19, 7 through 25, 33, 1 through 11, 34, 29 through 35, 2 Corinthians 3, 7 through 18, Psalms 103, 6 through 14. The place is Mount Sinai. The time is 446 BC. In a world that tends to focus exclusively on love, God's holiness is often overlooked. We prefer studying God's fatherhood and his adoption of us as children, the ways he has brought us near to himself. Yet, if we are to nourish our relationship with God and deepen our worship of him, we must study the glory of his holiness. In our first lesson of the quarter, we see that God's holiness and glory are interrelated. Moses could not stand the full glory of God, in part because of God's perfect holiness. At the same time, being in God's presence transformed Moses and worked in him greater holiness, just as it should for us. Today's aim, facts. To see how Moses interceded for the Israelites and how God responded by showing him his glory. Principle: to understand that God's holiness and glory are an integral part of his character. Application: to transform our lives by the glorious presence of God, which distinguishes us from those who do not trust in Jesus. Illustrating the lesson: even though we cannot see the whole glory of God and live, it transforms us and calls us to a life of holiness that reflects God. Practical points. 1. We need a mediator to stand in the breach and reconcile us to God. Exodus 33, 12 through 13, Psalms 106, 23. 2. God's presence gives the church its worth and significance. Exodus 33, 14 through 16, 1 Corinthians 3, 16 through 17. 3. The indwelling Holy Spirit assures us that we are chosen children of God. Exodus 33, 16, Romans 8, 16. 4. We find favor in God's sight because our mediator, Jesus Christ, has found favor in his sight. Exodus 33, 17, Romans 5, 2. 5. God wants us to make bold requests of him. Exodus 33, 18. 6. There will always be more to learn about our glorious God. Verses 16 through 23. Golden text. And he said, Thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. Exodus 33, 20. Today we have 4 lesson outlines. The first is astonishing request number 1. Exodus 33, 12 through 13. 2. Astonishing quest number 2. Exodus 33, 14 through 16. 3. Astonishing request number 3. Exodus 33, 17 through 19. Number 4. Inherent limitations for Moses. Exodus 33, 20 through 23. Introduction. Our first unit of the quarter delves into the holiness of God's presence. One of the overarching themes of the whole Bible is God's unfolding plan to dwell among his people as their God. Ezekiel 37:27, Revelations 21:3. But a huge obstacle stood in the way of that plan. Sinful humans could not get near God's holiness. Moses encountered that obstacle firsthand when the Israelites worshiped a golden calf in the wilderness and provoked the Lord to anger. The immediate consequences of that sin were bad enough, as many of the people died. But the worst part was the pronouncement God made in Exodus 33:3. I will not go up in the midst of thee, for thou art a stiff-necked people, lest I consume thee in the way. Moses' intercession in today's text came as a direct result of that gut-wrenching statement. In the process, Moses made three astonishing requests. Astonishing request number one, Exodus 33:12. And Moses said unto the Lord, See, thou sayest unto me, Bring up this people, and thou hast not let me know whom thou wilt send with me. Yet thou hast said, I know thee by name, and thou hast also found grace in my sight. Verse 13. Now therefore, I pray thee, if I have found grace in thy sight, show me now thy way, that I may know thee, that I may find grace in thy sight, and consider that this nation is thy people. Moses was about to probe into the very heart of who God is. He needed the assurance that the Lord was truly the kind of God who would pardon sin and take Israel as his inheritance, even though Israel was a stiff-necked and idolatrous nation. 34:9. Everything was riding on God's character. So, in the first of his bold requests, Moses prayed that the Lord would make his ways known to him if he had really found favor in his sight. 33:13. Moses was pleading to know the hidden intents and purposes of the Lord for his people. It was unclear to Moses how God's glorious plan for his people would come to fruition if their sin would only provoke his wrath and judgment upon them. The Lord had indeed bound himself to his people, but Moses did not see how that would end in anything but disaster in light of Israel's sin. Thus, Moses sought deeper knowledge of God's characters and ways. Astonishing request number 2. Verse 14. And he said, My presence shall go with thee, and I will give thee rest. Verse 15. And he said unto him, If thy presence go not with me, carry us up, not up hence. Verse 16. For wherein shall it be known here that I and thy people have found grace in thy sight? Is it not in that thou goest with us? So shall we be separated, I and thy people, from all the people that are upon the face of the earth. Moses knew there was no point in Israel going anywhere if the Lord did not go up with them. Although the Lord agreed to accompany Moses, verse 14, Moses pressed him to make the same promise for all the people of Israel, not just for him personally. Moses understood that if God's presence did not go with them, Israel would be just like any other nation, and their entire mission would be futile. Thus, he prayed that the Lord would not send them forward if he was not willing to go with them. Verse 15. Moses was holding out for something unspeakable. This was his second astonishing request, that a holy God would have so much mercy upon a stiff-necked people that he would go up with them to the astonishing request number 3, verse 17. And the Lord said unto Moses, I will do this thing also that thou hast spoken, for thou hast found grace in my sight, and I know thee by name. Verse 18. And he said, I beseech thee, show me thy glory. Verse 19. And he said, I will make all my goodness pass before thee, and I will proclaim the name of the Lord before thee, and will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. In response to Moses' request to accompany his people, the Lord answered in the affirmative, verse 17. God would go up with this stiff-necked people. He would extend his grace not just to Moses, but also to the rebellious people for whom Moses interceded. He went on to tell Moses that he had found favor in his sight and that the Lord knew him by name. That drove Moses to inquire ever more deeply into the nature of such a God who is lofty and exalted, but also willing to show such favor to undeserving sinners. Moses' request to see God's glory, Exodus 33, 17 through 18. The only thing left for Moses was to look into the depths of God's goodness for the assurance that his promise could really happen for such a wicked people. In other words, he needed to know what about God's own nature made his promise even possible. Moses was on the brink of asking the unthinkable. Like a person who stares into the heart of the sun or gets security clearance to a top secret meeting, Moses desired the loftiest thing of all, to see the glory of the Lord himself, verse 18. This was his most astonishing request yet. What did Moses mean by that request? What exactly did he want to see? What is the glory of God? Certainly, he was not merely asking for a special mystical experience. He was not asking to see a physical manifestation because that would not be God's essence. Rather, what Moses sought was a deeper understanding of the nature and essence of God. In asking to see the Lord's glory, he meant something like, let me have a glimpse into your divine nature. Let me see the meaning of your great name. Show me the foundation of this amazing promise. Give me some assurances that you will indeed grant your saving presence to this stiff-necked people. Thus, out of Moses' need for reassurance that God would not abandon him or Israel, he asked for God-given security clearance to understand the depths of the Almighty. Moses' daring request, in other words, was nothing less than a desire to have God confirm his stunning willingness to show such favor to an often rebellious and defiant people. Next, however, we must understand another level of Moses' appeal, namely the meaning of glory. What is the glory of God that Moses desired to see? Many may be aware that the Hebrew word glory carries the idea of weightness. When applied to a person, it describes a person of gravity, weight, and significance. When applied to God, however, glory describes all that he is that makes him infinitely significant. In other words, God's glory is nothing less than a summary way to describe the infinite worth and beauty of God because of the innumerable attributes that make him who he is. That is precisely what we see in God's response one chapter later. At the very moment when the Lord showed Moses his glory, he proclaimed his attributes, describing himself as compassionate, gracious, slow to become angry, full of faithfulness and truth, and forgiving, verse 6 through 7. This is the glory of God, his supreme worth because of his cumulative perfections that eternally define who he is. Thus, the plea of Moses to see the glory of God was a daring but right request to gain a deeper understanding of God's nature. That, in turn, led to God's affirmation of Moses' appeal, as well as God's own definition of his name. The Lord's response, Exodus 33:19. The Lord affirmed Moses' request by promising to cause all his goodness to pass before Moses and to proclaim his name as he did so. Here it is important to see the theology unfolding in God's reply. Moses asked to see the Lord's glory, and in response, the Lord affirmed that he would show his goodness and proclaim his name. Thus, God's glory, goodness, and name are complementary and parallel. Isaiah 48, 9 through 11. That tells us two things. First, the parallel between God's glory and goodness tells us that at the heart of God's essence is his moral beauty and perfection that always and only does what is best for his creatures. That inherent truth about God would provide Moses the assurance and hope that he sought. Second, in ancient times, someone's name was more than a self-designation. It was seen as something that revealed who that person was. Therefore, the parallel between God's glory and name indicates that God was going to reveal to Moses something essential to whom he is. That brings us then to the definition of God's name and glory. Upon Moses' request, the Lord proclaimed in concentrated form his glory, goodness, and name. He told Moses, I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. Exodus 33:19. Although God would add more detail in chapter 34, this statement is the glory of the Lord. It is who he is and the summary of his essential glory that Moses desired to see. What the glory revealed here about himself explains how and why God could dwell among such sinful, rebellious people without casting their extermination. Thus, such a profound theological statement from the Lord deserves a careful and thoughtful explanation. Clearly, the Lord desired to make known to Moses that his bestowal of grace and compassion on unworthy sinners proceeds from the very nature of his glory. As God's expanded statement in 34:6 through 7 indicates, God is also glorified by his wrath upon the unrepentant. But even there, the emphasis is on God's proclivity toward grace and compassion. His wrath only lasts a few generations, but his mercy lasts for 1,000 generations. God is unapologetically just and willing to judge the wicked, but he is not a God who takes pleasure in the death of the wicked. Rather, he is pleased when they turn from their evil ways and live. Ezekiel 33:11. Why did God so closely identify his glory with his grace and compassion? Three components of the Lord's compassion on sinners can help us understand how it brings glory to his name. First, God's extension of grace and compassion to sinners is unconditional. That is, no inherent merit or worth is the sinner required to earn God's bestowal of grace and compassion. There are no previous conditions that unworthy sinners have to meet to somehow merit the mercy, compassion, or grace they so badly need. That was clearly the case for Israel. By Moses' own admission, they were a stubborn and stiff-necked people, Ezekiel 34:9. They met no conditions that could in any way force God's hand to bestow his favor, love, compassion, or grace. And yet, God still offered it to them. Second, God's bestowal of grace and compassion upon sinners is always a free gift. He has the right to dispense grace as he sees fit. God's grace towards sinners is not the result of a bargain or negotiation between two parties. Rather, God offers it of his own free will. That is God's prerogative. He has grace and compassion on whomever he wills. 33:19. Third, God's lavish bestowal of grace and compassion is relational. The Lord clearly revealed to Moses that he desires to a people for himself. The Lord does not merely wish for earthly agents to do his bidding. He wants people to love him and delight in his ways. In other words, the Lord's compassion comes from his desire to supply a remedy for sin so that he may delight in his people. His compassion and mercy are a means to bring reconciliation between him and a sinful people so that he may dwell among them and they may find in him their deepest delight. Inherent limitations for Moses. Exodus 33:20. And he said, Thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. Verse 21. And the Lord said, Behold, there is a place by me, and thou shalt stand upon a rock. Verse 22. And it shall come to pass, while my glory passes by, that I will put thee in a cleft of the rock, and will cover thee with my hand while I pass by. Verse 23. And I will take away mine hand, and thou shalt see my back parts, but my face shall not be seen. God used anthropomorphic language in verses 20 through 23 to describe how he would reveal himself to Moses. We know that God is a spirit and thus does not have a physical body. John 4:24. So he was obviously not talking about a physical hand, face, or back. By declaring that his face is deadly sight to humans, God emphasized his holiness in contrast to frailty. He seemed to indicate not merely that sinners cannot see him and live, but that the human face cannot see him and live. Confusingly to modern readers, just a few verses earlier, Moses is said to have spoken with God face to face, Exodus 33:11. There is no contradiction, though, because as the rest of the verse indicates, the phrase face to face was an idiom meaning that Moses spoke with God as one would speak with a friend, not at a distance, but up close and unhindered. The anthropomorphic reference to God's face is simply used in two different ways in chapter 33. In summary, we see in this intense episode that Moses needed assurance. Knowing the people of Israel's propensity to provoke God and rebel against his ways, Moses feared that the future of the nation was in jeopardy. And indeed it was. The golden calf episode reflected the spiritual condition of the people, and so was only harbinger of more to come. Although the Lord did promise to accompany the people in response to Moses' appeal, Moses needed the deepest assurance that all of God's promises would remain fully intact. Thus, Moses pleaded to see God's very glory. That is, he desired to see and understand what makes God who he is. Moses understood that only rock solid assurance of Israel's great future had to come from God and his own incomparable nature, and not from the shaky nature of a sinful people. Thus, the Lord revealed to Moses and reveals to us that God's very nature leads him to have a compassion and grace on whom he will. That God says is his very glory and name. In other words, it is the glory of God to grant his grace and compassion to sinners. That is what it means for God to be God. And that's what Moses' deepest confidence that God could and would dwell among an undeserving people. His essential glory, goodness, and name means that he grants compassion and grace to the undeserving. That remains the great hope of undeserving sinners to this day. Questions. 1. Why did Moses ask the Lord to make his way known to him? 2. Why did Moses not want Israel to enter the promised land without God's presence going with them? 3. Why did Moses need to know something about God's nature? 4. What was Moses' most accomplishing request? 5. What is God's glory? 6. How did God promise to grant Moses his final request? 7. What is the relationship between God's glory, goodness, and name? 8. Which of his attributes did God emphasize when describing his glory to Moses? 9. How does God's compassion bring glory to him? 10. What does God's warning about seeing his face in Exodus 33:20 teach us about the relationship between God and humans? This concludes the Sunday school lesson. For Sunday, December 7th, 2025. Thank you for listening. If you please desire to do so, click the subscribe tab. God bless.